Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host, Wilfred Riley. Joining us in the conversation is Letitia Grady, better known as Clarity Speaks. And our guest this week is Pastor Nick Taliaferro, host of the Evening Words with Nick Taliaferro on WURD Black Talk Radio in Philly. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Charles. Good to be with you. And it's nice to meet you, Letitia and Will.
It's great to have you. You're a unique voice, and people are going to find out why. I have had the good fortune of being on your show. It is I guess, you talk about a lot of things, but if you had to pigeonhole the show, I'll let you describe the show. But the network is obviously political. It's from a Black perspective. It's a little bit more liberal. I tend not to be. You're always really kind to me. Sometimes the caller's not as much, but you always even killed and kind. And I appreciate that. And I wanted to, we've always wanted to not only hear different perspectives, but I have something a little that's been kind of boiling to the surface that I think, and often I am proven right based on news stories and comments when you get to talk about it. And I figured I would bring someone on like you, and we can kind of kick that around. But first, can you talk a little bit about your show, like what you talk about, who the target audience is of the show, and a little bit about WURD?
WURD is one of only, I believe it's 4 African-American owned talk stations in the country today. And so we serve intentionally the African-American audience of Philadelphia and the wider diaspora. But my show is designed to bring in a plethora of ideas from a wide spectrum of thought. I intentionally look for people who may not agree with the party line so that we can have vigorous conversation and or debate. I noticed that the title, I am a minister. I'm an ordained minister. I've pastored for years. I retired a couple of years ago from my pulpit, but I served as a deputy mayor in the city of Philadelphia for a few years, and as the executive director for the Commission on Human Relations, and as one of the founding organizers for the city's first reentry program, prison reentry program. And so my show is not religiously oriented at all, even though everybody knows I'm a minister. But the idea is to widen the spectrum of conversation, to open doors so that people can bring varying points of views, so that we can test some of our theories and some of our postulates against opinions and thoughts of others.
Well, that's great. I mean, and you started talking about your resume. I didn't even get into that. It's long and detailed and wide varying. We may get to some of the things, singer, songwriter, screenplay, all that kind of stuff. But the reason I wanted to talk to you, I have a pressing issue, as I mentioned before. So I believe, and Will loves to correct, he's our ombudsman. He loves to correct people. He may correct me when I'm wrong. But I believe that there is not as much disagreement in the Black community, at least nowhere near as what we see on social media, in articles and videos we see and such, in debates between Black conservatives and Black liberals. So I wanted, because you have guests, your listeners tend to be politically Democrats or liberals. So I wanted to have that as the starting, kicking off the conversation.
Sure.
So do you think, and then we'll hear from Will and Letitia, but do you think that they do? And let me tell you my premise. I know that they disagree vastly on some things. They may disagree in solutions. They may disagree in priority of the problems. But it's kind of framed like they're on total different, like the issues that they think are important are different. Their views on those issues are like 180 degrees different, like they're on different sides. And when I talk to people, and even in our conversations, when it's not a specific Democrat versus Republican conversation, like Biden and Trump, or who you got, or what do you think about the Democrats and Republicans, right? Got it. Polar opposites there. But if the conversation is just about an issue, like, what do you think about, the rising crime? What do you think about the economy? What do you think about this? I don't think they're that far apart on the importance of the issues. What are your thoughts?
I think you make a valid point there. What gives the appearance of a disparity when it comes to the issues is not the issues themselves, it's who we perceive the enemy to be. So if Donald Trump says X, Y, and Z, and you agree with him, then I have to disagree with you, even if we might be close on the issues. I'll give you a good example. I mean, this is, and I think that I'm on point on this one. The issue of abortion. Most, of course, I'm connected to the church, but I wasn't always. There are a few police officers in Philadelphia who will tell you that. But most African Americans eschewed abortion. I mean, back when I was growing up, a young lady got pregnant. She went down south to visit some kinfolk and came back with a little cousin.
Right.
I mean, but the idea of terminating life when it came along, Big Mama would say, we're not going to give up that baby. I mean, this was not our hill to die on.
Right.
However, when other voices of a more conservative ilk made it an issue, their litmus test, then the Black community found itself, saying my body, my choice. And leaning in a direction that said, and I don't even like the polarization of the discussion. Are you pro-choice or pro-life? I'm pro both. I believe people should have a choice, and I also believe that we should support life where we find it. And sometimes that creates some discomfort. But that's one of those issues where we're probably not that far apart, but because we perceive the enemy to be here, then I have to be over there. Right. Law enforcement is another place. I remember Cabrini Green was going to vote to have their liberties taken away for the purpose of enforcing law back in the 70s. I remember that. Because they said we need more law enforcement. And it's happening again now when the murder rate went up with the pandemic. People were saying we need more law enforcement. But then when people were saying back the blue and they were opposing the Black Lives Matter movement, then we backed away from it. And so sometimes the politics makes us appear to be further apart than we actually are.
Will, any comments on that?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. I mean, first of all, I think one point in terms of what Nick said, I don't think it's that there's not a lot of disagreement between Black conservatives and Black liberals. Because, I mean, there are things like abortion where men and women, different sides of the community, so on, can really go at it and debate. I mean, I think it's a good example. I think that the real issue is that there's not as much agreement in the Black community as is generally presented in kind of mainstream media at all. So, I mean, a take you often hear is 80+% of Black people vote for the Democrats. The catch there is that 55% of Black men don't vote. Figure for working class white men is identical, by the way. It's not a racial thing. And I mean, now we're seeing about 20% of those that do move toward the GOP or toward independent candidates. So, I mean, you're actually talking about a very narrow slice. I mean, you're talking about 70 to 80% of 45%. So on a lot of these issues, how to handle crime and so on, there's the same diversity almost, but the same diversity you see within most Caucasian communities. And, I could go into a whole long-winded thing about how you have to adjust for stuff like living in cities and Italians and Irishmen aren't known for GOP support and so on. But that's all almost beside the point. I think the issue is that there's not as much agreement as we hear, not that there's no disagreement. But I actually have a question for Nick, for the guest. I mean, when you say there's a real reluctance to support the conservative position, we don't even need to say the Republican position, on a lot of these issues, like, just thinking about the gym. I don't go to the barbershop very often, but I mean, the things people would actually say about, I wrote a list of these: crime, the things normal Black men would say about fatherlessness, illegal immigration.
Oh my God, yes.
My hometown of Chicago right now, that could border on the racist. Guns, the right to protect yourself, to have the piece, the weapon by your side, gay rights, transgenderism, just leaving that right there. Abortion, I wrote out as a 6th or 7th. But I mean, in terms of these actually conservative attitudes that exist, I guess kind of why not listen to the conservative case? Like when you talk about some of this disagreement that's automatic with the Republican Party or with conservative candidates, like I don't think Scott or Ron DeSantis is a racist. Why does that huge gap exist would be my question. So obviously there are a lot of Black men and women that think these things. Why is that so rarely said in public outside of the community?
When you say why is it not so rarely said, clarify what it is that's not being said so that I can be clear.
Well, in terms of like the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, like when you say
Right.
that there was a real reluctance to say something like back the blue, that if you ask, so this is, I'll talk about the way this looks in my profession. If you ask a very technical question, like, do you have a fairly good experience with LEOs, law enforcement officers in your own neighborhood? And do you support a decline in crime by whatever legal means that can be achieved? You see the same answers for blacks as you do for whites. But if you ask something like, "Do you back the blue?" you suddenly see the black figure drop to whatever it was, 11%. Why is there such a reluctance to kind of support some of these very mainstream positions that most black people hold? Like, why wouldn't the Republicans be more of an option in Philly or in my hometown? And I don't really have a political dog in this race. I'm an independent. That's just always struck me as crazy. And I gather this data professionally, so you see it day by day by day.
The context that in which a lot of these statements and positions and these talking points, like for example, back the blue. The context, the historical context, is probably where the difference is when you consider the historical position of police officers in African American communities. I grew up on the streets of Philadelphia. I lived in Chicago for a hot minute, but I was grown then. But I grew up on the streets of Philadelphia, and I can distinctly remember a time I was being chased by some gang members. And and as I ran out of the alley, I saw a couple of cops in a place, and I thought, "Oh, good, I'm safe." And as I was running, I saw them, reach down towards their holster, and I realized that I had to run from the cops and the robbers. I mean, so the history, the historical context of who police are, what they do, what they're for, is something that looms over the conversation that disallows me from simply saying back the blue without understanding who the blue might be and what the blue perceives their mission and purpose to be. That's not a conversation that Becky and Gretchen out in Oak Park have to have. They know who the police are. The police are officer friendly. But in a black community, we don't know exactly who the police are until we know them. And so we can't just sign on to a statement like that without that context being fully examined and parsed out. And that's where the problem comes about, especially with our conservative friends. Our conservative friends, many times they have a good point, but that point sometimes is decontextualized. It's separated from a history that suggests how you got to where you're going on this point is different from the road that I took to get to this point. For example, with abortion, I might believe in sustaining and supporting life wherever I find it, but I do not believe in a group of old white guys making laws and rules that determine how other people are going to live. And so you find yourself in an uneasy position of not being willing to accept the posture of, quote, our conservative friends, even if you're not completely comfortable with our, quote, liberal friends. And incidentally, I hate the use of labels, period.
Sure. But if I can ask one follow-up question there, it seems like a lot of this, and that was an excellent, eloquent answer, but a lot of this has to take place in the context of a discussion where there are not just two primary political philosophies, but in the USA, basically two political parties. So it's absolutely true that attitudes toward the police vary based on the race, the socioeconomic class, so on of a community. I mean, it probably won't shock you to learn that down here in Appalachia, there are plenty of white people that don't feel that the
I was
police.
just thinking that.
Yeah, the guys guarding the company store weren't always there to love you. But people here are more willing to say back the blue, usually. You'll see that sticker sometimes. And I think one reason there would be that there kind of are two options when, as you know, as a former public official, when it comes to police funding. I mean, you can increase that and monitor it really well, or you can decrease that. When it comes to police stops, you can increase those and monitor those really well. And there's a really high correlation between that and decreased crime, or you can decrease those and see whether crime increases. And I think a lot of people would argue with some justification that often in the black community, there seems to be more sympathy for things that call on this evocative history, like defund the police, that are actually going to do a lot of harm. Like the black homicide rate has doubled since the BLM movement began, since 2014. I would
Yeah,
date it.
but I don't think it's fair to conflate the two items as though one is causative for the other.
Well,
I
the
think.
tracking. Well, sorry, go on.
No, please, no, go ahead.
No,
Because I
I will
actually
say
cut you
that
off.
the tracking, myself and a guy named Bob Moranto, this is like a black guy and Italian guy. We're both from large cities. There was no, we lean a little right, but there was no like, we're going to show, the conservatives were correct. It was just, we looked at the correlation between declining police stops, not even funding. There are a lot of well-funded,
Hmm.
incompetent police departments, which is part of this paper. There were a lot of police departments we looked at, like Little Rocks, that really did have a problem with abuse of the citizenry, so on. But in the case of the large cities, New York, so on down the line, even Louisville here, you could do this direct tracking between the number of stops they were doing, not the number of dollars they got, and the number of people that were killed. And a lot of those were in Latino and poor white areas, but like 60% of them were just in black neighborhoods. So you really could run this math and you could say, well, if the police stop arresting people, there's going to be an increase in black deaths. And I think abortion, where Planned Parenthood clinics are located, so on, it would be another example. Is there are two options. One is like, we're going to remember history, memorialize that, use these evocative words, but a lot of brothers might die. And over here, the other comment is, well, we might use this somewhat rude slogan, but we'll fund the police and support diversity on the force, and there'll be fewer deaths. So I personally tend to back two, given that there are only two options. Dose.
You tend to now. I don't think there was a question there. That was more of a statement. So
Oh, well, I guess my question was why, and I think you already answered this stuff. So now we're just kind of talking, and like someone else is going to ask
yeah.
like the next 5 questions. We've been going for like 10 minutes here. But my question was just like, why is there, and to some extent you replied to this, but why is there so little support for two instead of one? Like I often find that not just black politicians when I
You mean
sympathize.
so much support for two parties?
No, so much
No.
support for position number one, I guess, which would be like the evocative history, the use of this beautiful language, but like we're actually still going to keep building these Planned Parenthood clinics, as versus position two, which would be, we're going to say some blunt things, but we're going to fund the cops. I think position two would probably be better for most working class neighborhoods.
Well, it's the idea of defunding the police was the pendulum swinging in the other direction. And sometimes cultures do that. They're way over here, then they go way over there. And the idea of defunding the police was, it's the same idea as a child who's been spanked by his parents. Say, I wish they were gone. I wish they were dead. And then your parents die the next day and you're hungry and naked and cold because you can't pay rent. Defunding the police was an extreme position. We know that. The unfortunate thing is that society now tends to hew in the direction of these false polarities, these false binaries of, are you here? Are you there? Are you pro-life? Are you pro-choice? Are you Republican? Are you Democrat? When there's all of this space in the middle where the conversation needs to take place and people never get there. But there is an overweening context though, in our culture when it comes to the Black community. And that is this: at the end of the day, regardless as to what the issue is, somehow or another, Black people tend to be minimized or disenfranchised when it comes to the metrics that will measure what success looks like. Now, don't get me wrong. There's always, you always have your exceptional people. You always have individuals who are going to make it. But by and large, even with affirmative action, at the end of the day, there were a lot of Black people who did very well, Clarence Thomas being one of them. But when it comes down to it, there were individuals who were parts of other groups that were doing even better. And so it always seems to be that Black people would find themselves at the lower end of the measuring rod when any kind of program comes down the pike. And so there's this suspicion that says that if you're for it, then I better double check it twice because I'm probably going to be better off being against it, as the old folks used to say down south. And that's not always right, but you have to understand where that suspicion is born, and you have to respect it. And we've got work to do to overcoming it. And I'm hoping that work will continue to grow. I mean, the 4 years of our last presidency did not necessarily help us much in that one. Did I just light a fire and kick a tire there for anybody?
No.
Not really. I'm
I,
not the hugest Trump fan. I think that's a good summary that there's a reason this attitude exists in the black
Oh yeah.
community. It's not just stupid irrationality. I would totally agree with that. I think the question, the debate, the last comment for me for real, but the
yeah,
question, the
please
debate is
let's
how
let
much
clarity get in
no, but
here.
like it's how much we do need to respect this. Like if people believe that the cops are murdering, average black man or urban white man thinks the cops shoot 10,000 unarmed people a year. Like these attitudes, you understand where they come from. The question is, how seriously do you have to take them? How do we get rid of them?
Point
Clarity.
made.
Okay. The first thing that comes to mind along the lines of what Will was saying earlier, and the question that he posed was, where did this polarization come from? Why is it that Black Americans would say not back the blue? And I would say that it's ideological. Somewhere down the line, we have been listening to the wrong people, in my opinion. And I'm saying this post Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. We have been listening to the wrong people. It is a social vanity almost. It is almost an intellectual dishonesty. We as Black Americans are smart. We know how to nuance. We know how to know whether or not a police situation is for us or against us. In my opinion, right? I just think it has more to do with who we're listening to. And who is feeding us information. In other words, from pre-K through graduate school, we have been indoctrinated to think a certain way. And it's just, again, an intellectual dishonesty to, on one hand, be able to reason very clearly concerning a matter. And then on the other hand, reason in an opposing manner because we believe that we have political opposition. So I just feel like it depends on who we're listening to.
Well, one thing I want to say is I think that there were good points made, obviously, all around, and I understand it. But I think if we had that same conversation with a different one of the issues, because both Nick and Will Will read a couple of lists, and he basically hit everything on my list except for one topic. And so crime and some of the other ones, and policing, like Nick said, there's a history there. And there's a lot of nuance and feelings and experiences that go into that. But if you go immigration and education, right, it makes the conversation a little easier. Because as you both said, from an immigration standpoint, most people, hell, I've seen many of them, like Will was talking about Chicago, that's against legal immigration, which, I differ with them. But illegally, most people in the Black community contend that the illegal immigration is wrong. We need to get a handle on it. It hurts. It saps resources. It's unfair. And we have no idea who the people are because they all get to come. Like, I'm in New York. And so watching the local news, it would be funny if it wasn't sad, because people keep saying asylum seekers. What asylum are they seeking? Ukraine, I guess you can say technically yes, but they keep saying from these, first they used to say Mexico, which was outrageous. Mexico's technically a first world country. So then they say Central America. But in New York, so they have the hotel where they're housing the people. It's the intake center. So you get bused there, you have to line up. So for the last week and a half, if you all haven't noticed, it's been national news about how they have no place to house the people. So they would have cameras of the people sleeping outside the Roosevelt. Anybody seen this? You've seen it, right, Will?
I've seen it. Yeah.
If you look at the pictures, they're all Asian and African.
They're now putting them in houses in middle-class Black and Latino neighborhoods, by the way. Like, they're asking people in New York and Philly to volunteer to host illegal immigrants. I'm trying to think of the right term, but whatever.
But to pretend that, but my point is to pretend that these are asylum seekers from Guatemala, when you're looking at them and you can see that they're Asian and African, is laughable, right? So no one really, but my thing is, this is where I go to what Letitia said, that maybe it's ideological in this point, because I don't know anyone in my circle, especially my Black circle, Democrat or Republican, who thinks this is good. They all think it's bad, but they never really speak out against it, right? So like Nick's point of why they don't say back to blue and speak out on anything that would be viewed as a conservative thing, maybe even abortion, makes sense. But immigration kind of shocks me, and I'm going to go to Nick, all of you, and let you respond to this. And the second one I mentioned was education. So regardless of the history of not teaching slaves to read, trying to limit the freedoms and the education of Blacks and all that stuff, that's more of a reason we should care about education, not less. in many major cities, we are failing kids across the board, black and brown worse, but we're failing everybody, right? So education is failing. You have all this stuff happening. Everybody knows that people are fleeing certain cities, but then when you ask them about it, it's weird, because what I find, and we're going to get to what you hear on a day-to-day basis pretty soon, but what I find is odd. People notice the problem, and so they'll call in a radio show if that's the topic and say, this is really bad, we really need to do something about it. But they can't really blame the Republicans, because the Republicans are feckless and they're not there in Baltimore, New York, and Chicago. So they don't blame the Republicans. But they also don't blame the Democrats. They just think that they say it as if it's just is. It's like, it's just bad and we need to fix it. Well, we need to figure out why it's bad. It's just bad. Right. So you're never going to fix it if we don't just flat out say the admission process is wrong. The way we're teaching them to read, we have to get specific about what it is, but we don't go that far. And if somebody were to call and say, I'm upset with a particular politician, I blame the Democrats, that they kind of rally the troops and defend them in a sense. Am I missing something there, Nick?
Well, you now, are we talking now about the educational piece or the immigration piece?
Or the immigration? Yeah.
Which one would you like me to?
I don't know, whichever you pick one. You can do whichever one you think is better.
Immigration?
Yeah.
The immigration piece, when it comes to the African American community, is not simply about the process of a person becoming a citizen or being allowed in this country. It's not even about whether there's enough money or resources to accommodate people who may come to this country, a country that touts itself as being the place that welcomes those who wish to better themselves and to work hard in doing so. Mm-hmm. But that's not really the issue with the African American community. The real issue, as I said before, the real enemy here is the xenophobic mindset that says we can't let certain people in this country because it dilutes what we consider to be the gold standard of what it means to be an American, which is to be someone of European descent. That's really what you are seeing, the pushback from the Black community.
Well, now I got a question. Where do they get that from?
Exactly.
Where do they get what from?
The fact that the xenophobic, the push against the illegal immigration is xenophobic, and it's people. I know what you're talking about.
History. Yeah, history is very clear. I mean, history shows.
But they're talking now. They're saying the people, because we keep going to history. We're saying that the people now are it's the replacement theory thing. Right?
The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and so when you look at the history of this country and you see the laws that were constructed to govern the admission of people from Mexico, and the laws that were constructed to govern the admission of people from Japan and China over in the West, right. And even I beg your pardon?
What are those laws?
In California, after the railroads were built and Chinese immigrants were used to build them, there was no need for Chinese people anymore. They began to construct laws that were specifically aimed at the criminalization
and the Act of 1917,
and then the Chinese Exclusion Act. But
yeah, I think that one of the things that's really coming up here is the conflation. And this is actually, by the way, the most coherent I've ever heard this done. That's a compliment. But between like history and the present. So like,
well, I mean, okay, let's take a look at the present.
But I mean, obviously, Black Americans were denied citizenship in the USA.
Well, let's take a look at the present.
1865 with the Civil War Amendment. I'm more than willing to do that. But just a quick comment on these laws that we're citing point by point. Chinese Exclusion Act, I believe, ended in 1933. We revamped U.S. immigration law with the Immigration Act of 1965, which was designed to bring a more diverse population. So when someone says, obviously, there's probably, so first of all, I would agree from both whites and blacks, there's probably some xenophobia toward like them foreigners. That's true in every country in the world. I wouldn't foolishly deny that. But what I'm saying is that when you look at something 58 years after the last arguably racist immigration law, the argument, well, we have a somewhat racist history, like, okay, that's true.
Did you say somewhat?
Compared to where? China still excludes people that aren't Han now.
But we're not talking about China.
You have to put things in context. I'm not going to compare us to heaven.
But Will, that's what I'm doing. Here's the context. Let's talk about now.
Okay, but
when the
about this though, there's one question that I would ask sincerely. if you're arguing about illegal immigration today, the question would be, how do illegal immigrants from Caucasian failed states help Black people?
I mean, you can take the narrative in that direction, but I'd like to finish answering what I was saying, which is this. We wanted to talk about what we're seeing today. When the Ukraine exploded, and there was a need to get people here from Ukraine, you didn't hear a whole lot about, well, what's the process?
Not true.
Where we
people didn't want them here. People did not want them here.
What people are you talking about, Charles?
On the right.
Excuse me?
What people are you? I mean, I didn't hear any hue and cry from anybody. Now, don't get me wrong. There were people. There were some people who were very loud on the right who didn't like the idea of the United States supporting Ukraine anyway, who had a political axe to grind on it. But I'm talking about. I'm talking about going into the chambers of legislation where people are making long speeches and where people are trying to construct laws to prohibit an action. You did not have that with Ukrainians. Well, and I defy either of you to tell me that you did, because it didn't happen.
I actually would respond to that and say two things. One, it depends what you mean. The Ukraine war overall, and just a Google Scholar search can tell any of us at our level, this has been one of the most opposed things, especially on the political center right, in recent U.S. history. And a big part of that is objection to immigration. But a second point, the Ukrainians are refugees. Like, I'm not a big fan of the Ukraine war, but Ukraine's actually at war. So, like, all of this, the point that there's a racist history in the USA is a correct point. The right denies that too much. That's a point scoring point for Nick. But you also have to ask all these other points, like, why are we allowing people to lie and say they're refugees from Mexico? Does that benefit Black people? Like, both can be true. Two balls can be in the air.
I mean, I have been in touch with the people who are at the border. The vast majority of these people are not coming from Mexico. They're coming from other places in Central America. However, it's not. I mean, when you say, Will, and this is now, this is disturbing that people are lying, saying that they're refugees.
They are.
This is a universe. I actually will say, this is a professional comment.
Tell me what you mean by lying. What do you mean by lying?
Wait, Nick, what he means by that, to be fair, he's not saying that there's a definition of what classifies a person as a refugee. And let me finish this.
Yeah, I can actually
leaving a country because it's poor and there are more jobs in the US. God bless you. But that is not qualified as the definition. Last point, I'll let you two go at it. But I'm in New York. They're busting.
We're all friends.
So they're interviewing the people in New York, right? And they're sleeping on the streets. I mentioned. It's like, man, if I would have known this, I wouldn't have come. So what they talk to them a lot. They just ask for the question. Say, so why'd you come here, man? I heard that there were jobs here. That's not a refugee, Nick. That's a statement of fact that person's not a refugee.
I accept that as anecdotal, but that is not.
How is it anecdotal?
It is anecdotal because I don't know who you talk to.
I'm watching the news. I didn't talk to but I'm watching the local news as they're interviewing person after person on the line.
We just talked about the failure of the local news to give.
There are like 10 professional studies of this. Like, a refugee, an asylum seeker. To answer Nick's highly on point question, like when you said you're a little disturbed by this, are we just these right wing brothers making fun of these poor?
I did not say anything about right wing brothers.
I know, but okay, like. But look, there actually is a serious answer to this. This is now some of the stuff I said just BS.
Give me the answer.
But this is my professional capacity answer. There are multiple studies of the asylum seeking process. The argument that illegal migrants, or undocumented if you prefer migrants, are in fact asylum seekers or refugees is something that began around 2010 with groups like Amnesty International recognizing this as a loophole in U.S. law. So an asylum seeker, that's something that comes from a condition just short of war, quote unquote. That's usually meant natural disasters, big earthquakes, like what we unfortunately saw in Haiti, so on. When we've actually seen people from these countries, these stable second world countries, big sources include like Guatemala, China.
Did you just call Guatemala stable?
I've been to Guatemala. Yes, it's a poor country, but there's no war currently going on. El Salvador cut crime to almost nothing. Like, I've actually been to some of these countries. Like El Salvador, Bukele, the president, just reduced crime to a lower level than that in many of our cities. You can criticize these countries. You can say they're very poor, but there's no argument that there's an ongoing military conflict or natural disaster. Now, moving on from my opinion, when people have actually looked at how current asylum seekers from Honduras do in asylum hearings, rejection rate is like 85% flat across the board. Because
let me get past your statistics and because
you can't get past the statistic that we rejected them all.
If you let me get past it, I'll show you why I want to get past them. What I'm talking about,
because they're inconvenient.
Well, no, it's not that they're inconvenient. What I want to talk about is the fact. First of all, when you say a stable Guatemala, Guatemala is not stable.
What sense do you mean that?
El Salvador is not stable. I mean, these are countries where lawlessness and gangsterism are so prevalent that it makes the community where I grew up, which was very lawless and gangsterist, it makes it look like Disney World. And back to what Charles was saying about people looking for jobs. I get that. There are people who come looking for jobs, but many people are coming to escape. I'll give you a really good example. We helped a family here in the city of Philadelphia who ended up staying in a church for over 2.5 years because they had been in this country. They left the country where they were because the brother of the family was murdered. The father was threatened. They escaped from the country, came here. They were living here, paying taxes. And then the new administration said, you got to go home. And we kept them in a church as a matter of asylum until we were able to get them the asylum that they deserved. And they are here now as tax-paying citizens.
You didn't say the country they were from. Was that country at war?
No, the country wasn't at war. The country wasn't at war, but there was a warlike environment within the country.
That does not qualify.
And they also say, but that.
Well, I get what you're saying, but I get what you're saying about the legality of it, and that is,
but that's what
if you
matters.
define,
now, if you want to change the policy, you can change the policy.
Well,
But
then,
it doesn't make a person
and that's one of the things we're trying to do.
But that's fine, Nick. I'm okay with that. But it doesn't make a person racist or xenophobic.
But here was my original point. My original point is that America has demonstrated a willingness to accept white imports of humanity over people of color.
Totally untrue. Totally
true.
You're
Absolutely
not
true.
For the other variable of that
more
country actually
than any other
being
country
at
in
war.
the world.
That's because they're more non-whites who find themselves in conditions where they might need to move.
No,
I'm not talking about the numbers, Charles. I'm saying about the willingness to accept them.
But Nick, I don't mean.
I'm saying the willingness.
I'm talking about.
Let's see what clarity says.
Process.
What I am talking about.
Again, this is going back to ideology. Where do we get all of this from, right? We were talking about these conditions that exist.
The history.
Hold on just a moment.
Sure.
I'm going to tell you about the history. I want everyone who's watching, please read a book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense by Manning Johnson. And he gives you some insight on why it is that Black Americans are thinking along these lines. Like we just spoke a moment ago, where Black people, very intelligent Black people, can think along a particular track, right? And then all of a sudden, when there's a racial component here with the Black and white, we come off the rails, and then we start to reason in a way that is irrational. And so,
who's reasoning irrational now?
No. And I'm talking in terms of just as Mr. Charles was just basically saying, this is what the law is, and we're reasoning this based on the law. But if you're talking to certain Black Americans who have a certain ideology, then they will impose and say that, oh, this is this way because America is racist because our history, we have this particular history. And I'm saying that Black Americans are smart enough now, particularly post Jim Crow, that we can nuance, right? And know that this particular situation applies in this manner, and this particular situation applies in this manner, if we're being intellectually honest, and if we're not tethered to some sort of ideology. And again, we have to go back to, where do we get this sort of thinking from? Because all of what we're discussing, Black people have voted for a lot of the things that they are opposing.
Let me ask a question. What point am I making so that I can see whether or not I'm being heard? What point am I making?
Do you want us to like answer in sequence?
Well, I will say this.
Either of you. Yeah. What point do you hear me trying to make?
Well, I will take that. I would think there's a lot. I won't say just on immigration. The larger issue is you're saying, you're using the context, which is fine, and saying people have reasons to have concern about whatever the issue, because there's a historical context that needs to be viewed. So which is not an issue. My concern, and I'll put this back to you and say, do you think that there's an issue if, just like you were making it clear that there's an issue if we don't factor that into our equation? Is there also, would you say, an issue that if we focus on it too much, that we are willing to ignore any possible positive outcomes from something, and understand that the situation might be different now? Of course. So the response to that might be different now than it was then. We can't use the same old tactics. So one example would be what Will kind of made it with the immigration thing. Whatever the racist history of immigration in America has been, you say we need to reference the history. If that history, and my knowing that history as a Black man, makes me question the conflict at the border and side with people, regardless of whether it's right or wrong or legal, because I'm thinking about the history, and that causes me to allow a large number of people in my community that is already distressed to sap resources, and it hurts my community, that's okay, because at least I didn't fall into the trap of some history. So I'm just saying, in situations like that, aren't we taking history a little bit too far and giving it a larger weight than
we're not taking history too far. Let me answer that succinctly. We're not taking it too far, but I will agree with you, Charles, that hyperfocus will always exclude an ambient view that would lead to better conclusions. Always. I get that. Now, in saying that, I'm saying, actually, in saying that, that doesn't mean that we're taking it too far. Because there are times when you push harder because of the resistance you're getting from people who are trying to deny the reality of the history that you're trying to bring. Here's the problem: you're not context. Here's the immigration is a great example, because what you're doing is you're saying, look, because immigration is interesting because you're not talking about the Black experience. So if you're talking from a context of Black people and they're questioning, I don't trust this immigration thing, and then you say, give me an example, and they say, the Asiatic Exclusion Act. They say, this group. They say the Cambodian boat people. They say, Mexican immigration. So none of that's Black. So your argument is that so you're arguing on behalf of them. No. Let me make that. That's my point, right? So let me clarify my point. My point was that was in response to whether or not America has demonstrated a level of prejudice against non-white immigrants. I was simply saying, historically, we have seen that they have preferred.
And we agree that that's the case, but we said that has nothing to do with what's happening today.
Until 1965, didn't sound like y'all were agreeing. Non-white immigrants. But I mean, like the Immigration Act of 1965 actually makes it much easier to come here from the New World.
Well, I mean, that's and Will, that's a very pleasant snapshot. I'm looking at the moving picture. I mean, that's like saying that Reconstruction showed that we really wanted to help Black people. Yes, it did for the minuscule period of time that it was effective.
That's a good counterpoint, but the difference is that the 1965 Immigration Act still applies. So, I mean, I think
it still exists. It doesn't necessarily apply.
So what do you want to happen at the border that you think is still Black? You think letting everyone in is going to help the Black community?
The question here was not what I think needs to happen at the border. The discussion we're having is why Black people are suspicious of immigration policies as they're being built. I've never even approached, like what I think needs to happen with immigration. I will be the first to acknowledge and admit that sometimes Black communities are as against immigration as anybody. I remember standing in a restaurant that was owned by Asian people. And they were Koreans, and a young Black child was saying, well, I don't even know why all y'all Chinese coming over here anyhow. Now, it was an ignorant thing to say, but it demonstrates a level of resistance against the presence of the other, which is a human trait. I mean, I think Will made mention of that before. I mean, it's a human trait. Homogeneity is preferred by most people. We like looking at people who look back at us looking like us. I get that. I'm not here saying that, Black people are all right and all of this. I'm simply saying this is an impediment to having a broader discussion about it. And it's a legitimate impediment. that we have to be able to talk
And
about.
what I'm saying is that one of the reasons for the impediment is an indoctrination that we have, suffered from pre-K through graduate school. That is what I'm kind of getting at. Like, where are we? Like we can't even penetrate. We can't even again, post Jim Crow. I would argue that white people are Black people's biggest untapped resource, simply because of mindset, that we are too, like, if I go right now and I align myself with someone white, there's going to be somebody in my Black community calling me a coon, a sellout, or something like that. You know what I mean? Or if a Black person is, I've seen many Black businesses, for example. I remember some time ago, Shea Moisture, they were trying to expand their market base, and they made the mistake of putting someone on their marketing that had a lighter skin, and they suffered the consequences of that from the Black community. And so my point is that there's a mindset here. There is an indoctrination here, and an ideology that we have to unpack and nuance and be honest about. That's all I'm saying. And I agree with you. Everything that you talked about in terms of history, all of that is true. But we're here in the 21st century. And all I'm saying is, there are times when, if we want to use police brutality or immigration, there are cases that we may have to nuance and be like, oh, that is racist. Oh, that is a problem. But then there's others that we that don't apply. And I'm saying that we are so indoctrinated that we can't even acknowledge those that don't apply. That's
so Nick, what are the topics that people are talking about? Like, what are the hot topics that you think people?
Segue.
What'd you say?
That was a segue.
You get whiplash with that segue.
Why did you want to reply? Feel free.
Well, I mean, just in brief, because I think Letitia makes a point. Indoctrination is a word that can be used. I think another word that might be more fitting is that the community from which all of us come, and we're all impacted to one degree or another, but the more education and enlightenment you get, truth and education can give you a level of freedom. But by and large, the trauma that was introduced by the American experiment as it concerned people who came to this country as enslaved individuals and their offspring is something that we are just shaking free from. It is, hundreds of years of de facto disenfranchisement and discrimination doesn't just fall off quickly. I am a student of trauma-informed therapy. I've taught it. And when people have been traumatized, they become hypervigilant to the point that there are times they cannot see things that others might clearly see. And so when you talk about what has happened to African American people, one writer talked about post-traumatic slave syndrome. I'm not sure I'm willing to go that far, but there is an impact that comes about it. And then there is the de facto, how shall we say it, disparities that exist between the Black community and the white community in America that leads to certain behavior patterns and traits that we are just coming to grips with. I mean, for example, to deprive certain communities of resources and to create scarcity and to deny a certain level of enfranchisement and access. If you take a couple of docile white mice and let them live in a large cage, they'll live peacefully together. But if you put them in a very tight space and deny them resources and deny them opportunities to relieve themselves of the issues of life, they will become enemies and they'll become harmful one to another. And this has happened in Black communities with redlining and the denial of loans and so forth. And it created certain conditions that we're still trying to work our way through.
Nick, can I ask you two quick questions then? You
Sure.
mentioned in that piece about education, being more educated and educating yourself and learning some things can help free you. Early on in the conversation, Will made a point, when we were talking about do we disagree or not, and he said that it might be a different factor. It might be that some people don't vote and that there's a a lot of different varying views that aren't really looked at. We look at it like we think the same way, and we don't. But when he mentioned that a lot of people don't vote, that what's interesting there is the reason, as Letitia says, she says it's an ideology that people skew left. It tends to be that the more educated people get, especially graduate degrees and in certain disciplines, the more liberal you get. So you got a section of the normal population, regular working class people who aren't voting. So that skews the number. So of the pot of people who are voting, you leave out 20%, maybe higher. Of those people, they tend to be further, but they're more educated. And I watch, maybe this different because now you make it a smaller circle because you're talking about the people who are affluent, yes, writing and speaking and on TV on these issues, and they are the most likely to talk about, all the things that are holding them back in their, immense success. And then so that's one thing that I find kind of odd to the education piece you mentioned, and how, as you learn more, you grow. They seem to be more stifled by what they learn. And then, the other thing is you talked about, prior to the mice analogy, you were talking about disparities. And I wonder why we always compare ourselves to whites. Why is that? Or why are they the benchmarks? I mean, in my opinion, that's your white supremacy. Like, I'm doing well, but let's see how Tyler Perry said it once. Tyler Perry was being interviewed by Anderson Cooper, and he made some phenomenal points, right? It was like 5 minutes. It was great. He was talking about policing. It was nuanced. It was smart. It was like, we can't look at everybody the same way. It was great. But then at the end, he tells the story about how, look at my life. I was poor. I was homeless for a while. I became very successful. And my studio sit on X number of acres. And it sits on land that was owned by a slave owner, which owned one of my ancestors. So now I own all this land. Now that's a testament, a hat tip to the American dream. Great. He could have ended it there and it would have been wonderful. Then the last line he says, but Anderson, imagine how successful I'd be if I was white. Oh, God.
Well,
really?
I don't know why. I don't know why Tyler Perry said that. I
right,
can't
because
get
the average person, white or black, is not a millionaire. So
but you
to
ask
reach that
a
height
question
and say, "Imagine if I was white."
But you ask a legitimate question. Why do people compare themselves to to black people compare themselves to white people? It is not a comparison to white people and white individuals. I don't look at a white guy and say, am I doing as well as he's doing? But life experiences are typically measured through relativity, and that is how I'm seeing. Wait a minute, am I doing okay? And it tends to be a matter of relativity. How are others doing? If when I grew up in North Philadelphia, I didn't realize I was poor because everybody around me was just like me. It wasn't until I went away to school to an all black college, incidentally, an HBCU, and realized that I didn't have a lot of stuff other people had. It's relativity. And when you look at a situation, if you want to do an experiment, there's a gentleman by the name of James Gilligan. I'm looking at his book right now. James Gilligan is one of the foremost authorities on violence as a human expression and as a sociopathological reality. He says one of the leading causes of violence in any culture, not just American culture, is disparities of wealth and resources between people. He says in any culture you look, when you find great disparities between the haves and the have-nots, you will tend to have a more violent society because relativity tells you things.
Yes, but are the haves white and the have-nots are black in America today?
Well, by and large, the white community, I mean, they have all sorts of metrics that they use. The wealth of families. White America has done better than Black America for good reasons. I mean, and that is that it was designed that way. That doesn't mean that some Black people didn't do well. I mean, like Charles, you're rich. I mean,
Thanks for telling everybody. We're recording this, right?
All these guys are just laughing, like, yeah.
But I mean, but America. I mean, we see things like the situation in Ocoee, Florida, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, where when Black people started doing well,
in Tulsa, Oklahoma?
Well, in 1921,
1921.
Oh, I thought you were talking about
there was a
2023.
horrible.
My bad, my bad.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
history again. I'm sorry, I forgot.
Yeah, what it shows that there is something that says
What happened in Tulsa, by the way? You're talking about Black Wall Street, right?
Yeah,
Where they burned it down and the racists attacked them.
yeah.
Well, how did they destroy the wealth? Didn't there have to come wealth first?
Yes, but
so why
that's
do we never talk about the creation of wealth? We're just talking about the racists who tore down.
We do talk about the creation of wealth,
Very
but we
rarely.
also
it's always about look at what happened. When you said look at what happened, you weren't talking about
that's because the human.
I think
Charles,
Black Wall Street is
when
pretty
you said
well
look at
discussed
Tulsa,
from all sides. The real issue, I think, for a critic is that this was in 1921.
This is my issue. let me handle this, Charles. The issue is the human brain is wired to measure negativity because you only need one bad day to die. And 364 sunny days ain't gonna do you no good. So we tend to look at that bad day. What happened in Tulsa was you had Black people doing well, and the enmity and the animosity built to the point where the adversarial spirit and the jealousy came out. And so people say, wait a minute, even if I work hard and do well, there's an environment that will try to take it from me.
And you don't think it's a problem that we focus on that more than we focus on how they did it?
I don't think we focus on it. I don't think we focus on it more.
Whoa. You don't think we focus on the massacre more than we talk about?
No, I don't think we focus. No, I don't think that.
Obviously, we do, but the bigger structural
that's not true.
The bigger structural issue would seem to be that
that's not true.
Race riot in 1921.
Will, that's not true.
Virtually, so like when you talk about
that is not true.
You say it's not.
We can disagree on that. When you talk about whites as the benchmark for America, of the 10 richest groups in the USA, 8 are people of color.
I never said
pretty much every time someone points that out, the response
come on.
is, well,
we can cherry pick. We can cherry pick a few here and there. We're talking about first. Let me just go to the first one. We do not focus at it more. It's just that we pay care. It is spoken of because of the aberrant nature of what happened. We focused on how they built that wealth. That's how you had a lot of the black colleges that were built, the black insurance companies in North Carolina. The way we knew how to build the wealth. The question was, how can we sustain it and keep it in a society that is so perniciously opposed?
What percentage of people do you think know that it was built back, that they built their businesses back?
I'm not even talking about what they did in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the lessons that led to the building up of Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Hayti area in North Carolina. Beg pardon? You're from there?
Yeah, I'm right there. There's actually a Hayti cemetery in my 3 miles from here. Where I live. I mean, actually 10 miles, yeah.
I mean, they, what they produced, I mean, in building that up and then facing those things that tried to tear it down. Mm-hmm. I mean, so what happens is you become wary of, when you go to the beach, the first thing you hear is the music of Jaws in the background. Although a shark ain't gonna come and bite you in the behind. It is extremely rare, but you recognize if that rare thing happens once, it could be the end of you.
Well, if you spend your time worried about Jaws, it limits your beach experience. And if you spend your time worried about 1920, it limits what you can do in 2020.
I will readily, like I said before, trauma produces hypervigilance.
But why is there an assumption that we're all traumatized?
I didn't say we were. I said that there is.
So who is the trauma that's being?
Well, there's still large numbers of people who are undergoing.
How do we know which
ones
are traumatized and which ones aren't?
Well, I guess you have to figure. They, for example.
But you say we all have a collective experience.
Man, you gonna let me answer one question? The ACEs study from Kaiser Permanente is doing a great job in helping us to see, what level of trauma exists in some of our young people. I mean, we're doing better. I am not a rosy-colored optimist, but I am an optimist. I believe that we're doing better. I'm not a black guy who's going to say things are getting worse and worse and worse. I think we're doing a whole lot better. I think being able to have this discussion is reflective of the fact that we're doing better. I mean, I have to help you and Will a lot.
Somebody's got to bring us along, Nick, because we're behind. Naive and non-trauma-centered lives.
I want. This is something you asked. What are people talking about right now? All across this country, not only blacks but white people are talking about what happened in Montgomery, Alabama, at the river
Wow.
at the river. They're talking about it because it is reflective of something. You know, it isn't the first time that a melee at a dock led to a paradigm shift in the way people viewed themselves and the way they acted. In 1773, a bunch of white folks went to a dock and tore stuff up. And from that moment, they shifted the way they viewed themselves, and that led to the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party. Now, and what it was is they said, wait a minute, we've got to stick together. Everybody didn't agree. Ben Franklin and George Washington were totally opposed to what happened in the Boston Tea Party. But they said, we got to stick together because we have a common impediment and we have common goals, and now we have to work together. When Black people, and I tell you, it's, you know, I hang around a lot of ministers, and ministers were troubled by the fact that they were watching this violent reaction with people hitting people over the head with chairs, but they were laughing while they were watching it and celebrating. And they couldn't figure out why they're celebrating. It's not because of the hatred. It's not because white people got beat up. It was because they saw a synergizing of effort and interest in Black people in a place where that was disallowed. I mean, Montgomery, Alabama was where the first White House of the Confederacy existed. I mean, it's where Rosa Parks was arrested. It's where Martin Luther King and 1,000 other people were hemmed in a church by a white mob who simply didn't want freedom riders to come through. And so you saw in that very place a reaction that said, we will stand up for ourselves and we will fight for our own self-determination. That is what people saw. And I think it's going to be a shift in the way members of the larger Black community see themselves. And it will lead, I believe, to a level of community building that might take us to the next level. And Will is saying, Will is saying, what was he smoking before he came on the show?
Will, what do you have to say about
I would
that?
love to see that same tenacity and unity relative to political power.
Education, everything
right,
else,
right. You know, coming together along that with that same sort of tenacity.
It takes time.
It
takes time.
To see that, it was inspiring, right? To see us, you know, all get on one accord and go fight for one another and swim across the ocean.
I mean, a 16-year-old swimming to come to the rescue, you know.
But my thing is, you know, like where I want to see us do that where it actually matters and can make an impact. But again, and like you said, this conversation is very encouraging, you know, in light of what you're saying, because again, to get back to what we were saying, I don't think any of us is really disagreeing, you know, right? It's just we're kind of parsing and nuancing here. But I would love to see us as Black Americans, you know, join together politically, you know, and educationally and make a huger impact.
Well, I think that now that Will agrees with everything that I said.
Well, you've said his name twice. We got to let Will close this out.
Yeah, so
Will?
guys, I have a pretty non-confrontational comment. I've enjoyed talking to Nick and listening to Nick talk. By the way, you can see that he probably had some game as a preacher. Like it's definitely some interesting stuff. I think that people tend to have lodestones in terms of how they approach things. So Nick, yours seems to be history. We need to analyze events in the context of history. Mine is kind of statistical reality, which is a biased way of putting it to some extent. But like, what do the numbers actually say? Like if we have an immigration policy and we let in all these people from white failed states, like I'm not a racist, but that would describe Ukraine, much of Latin America, so on down the line. Is that logically going to be good for Black Americans or indeed for my working class white buddies in Kentucky? That would be my basis. What do the numbers say? Clarity seems to be looking at kind of critical review, like why do people have the ideas that they have, which I think was kind of a new dimension added to everyone else sort of trading points and kind of sparring a little bit verbally. So there's nothing really right or wrong about that. But my take on the kind of the grounding in history is that obviously you're an uneducated fool if you don't know your history. It would be embarrassing to meet an educated Chinese who didn't know what Confucius was, so on down the line. But also in the context of what the numbers are, I feel that that history is very often exploited by political players, especially on the left, who aren't any kinder than the political players on the right. And I think this is a real point. Like when you said, I'm sure just as many people know about the development of Black wealth, and North Carolina comes to mind, Northern Texas comes to mind, Chicago, as know about X racial conflict. I don't think that's true. And I don't know.
I did not say that.
Okay, well then, my fault. If anyone makes that argument, that is false. I think you can empirically go check that out. And so I think that a lot of the focus on history takes this form. In 1822, this horrific incident occurred. And just the other day, they killed the brother George Floyd. Nothing has changed. Vote for the Democrats. And very often, in my actually professional opinion, the policies that come out of that are extremely negative for the Black community. So sure, you should know your history. Know your history in context. Slavery existed everywhere in the world until the 1800s, except a few European countries. They had serfs, 2 African states I can think of. But I mean, know your history, know it in context. But that's often, to me, irrelevant to the question of should we focus more on nuclear power? And I think that's an important thing to keep in the conversation. We absolutely shouldn't mock people, Black Americans, Appalachian Americans, for saying, I'm skeptical of this. It sounds a little like the chain gang to me. But the question also has to be, what is that policy going to do to clean up crime, good or bad, in 2023? So that would be kind of my lodestone guided comment. That's probably really it for me. Like, what does that mean today?
All right, final word is, we started this out by asking, why is it that Black people either think a certain way or can't think a certain way? I lent the perspective of, because history has taught them to be hypervigilant about the people who are making the rules and so forth. And while I believe in statistics and I believe in measuring what is happening in our current and relevant circumstances, if all you do is measure it without history, that would be like cutting off a guy's legs last week and then next week having a test to see who can jump the highest. And the guy who had his legs cut off last week can't jump as high as the guy who has 2 good legs. And you say, well, he's not jumping that high, is he? Well, you got to understand how he got to the place where he can't jump that high. And that is why history is an absolute necessary partner for statistics and the measuring of realities as they currently exist.
Right. Well, I wish we would have had a chance to get to the reason I was asking what they're talking about is because I believe that the issues that are most pressing to people who listen to talk radio and are calling in, are not the issues that we hear on the headlines and the clickbait and all that. So it'd be interesting to hear what they think about it. I guess we have to do a part 2, because I still don't believe that we disagree left, right, center on, let's say, crime. Everybody wants violent criminals locked up. The difference is, how long, what they consider crime, a violent criminal is, and those kind of things. That there's nuance around that. Everybody wants better education, all these other things. So I think that if we could agree on what we agree on, we can start working on solutions. But Nick, it's been great having you. It's Nick Taliaferro, the host of the Evening WURD on WURD. Nick, it's been fun. Thanks for joining.
It's been a real pleasure. It's nice to not be the host and to be able to just push back without having to be moderating.
Right. You don't have to be all nice.
Yeah. It was really fun. I really appreciate it, Will, and I appreciate it, Letitia. Thanks for the invite, Charles. The US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.